My parents threw me out on Christmas morning with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. They believed that leaving me out in the freezing cold would scare me into signing away my college fund to cover my father's gambling debts. They thought I had no choice. They had no idea my grandfather had already planned for the day they would finally show me who they really were. Please stick with me because what happened after that Christmas morning completely changed my life. My name is Brenna Hale and I was 19 years old when my family fell apart. Growing up, I believed my parents always knew what was best for me. Looking back now, I realize they were only interested in staying in control. Every decision I made had to be approved by my father, Gavin, while my mother, Leona, stood beside him and never questioned anything. A few days before Christmas, my father placed several papers in front of me and told me to sign them. He claimed the family was dealing with temporary business problems and that he only needed access to my college fund for a short time. Something about his story felt wrong, so I refused. Later, I overheard a phone call that revealed the truth. The money wasn't for any business. He had lost a huge amount through gambling and wanted my future to pay for his mistakes. Christmas morning became the worst day of my life. My father exploded with anger, calling me selfish and ungrateful. My mother joined him without hesitation. They stuffed my clothes into trash bags, opened the front door, and told me not to come back until I was ready to sign the papers. I stood outside shaking in the cold while neighbors quietly watched from their windows. No one said a word. As I sat at the end of the driveway trying to understand how my own parents could do this, I remembered a Christmas card my grandfather Elias had mailed to me just a few weeks before he passed away. I had never opened it because the grief was still too painful. With frozen hands, I carefully unfolded the card. Taped inside was a tiny key, a handwritten letter, and one sentence that made my heart stop. For the day they show you who they really are. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the letter. I kept reading each line over and over, trying to believe what my grandfather had written. It felt like he was sitting beside me, speaking directly to me one last time. Grandpa Elias wrote that he had watched my parents for years. He saw how my father, Gavin, constantly borrowed money, made promises he never kept, and blamed everyone else for his problems. He also knew my mother, Leona, helped him hide the truth instead of stopping him. They smiled in front of other people, but behind closed doors they manipulated anyone they thought they could use. He admitted there had been many times when he wanted to confront them. The only thing that stopped him was me. He feared they would cut off all contact between us if he challenged them openly. Instead, he stayed patient and quietly prepared for the day I might need help more than advice. The small key taped inside the card belonged to a safety deposit box at his bank. According to the letter, only I could open it after my 19th birthday. Grandpa ended the letter with simple instructions. If I ever found myself completely alone with nowhere to turn, I was to go to the bank as soon as Christmas was over. He promised that everything I needed to rebuild my life would be waiting there. I looked around at the snow-covered driveway where I had been left with nothing except a few bags of clothes. For the first time that day, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. I couldn't stay outside forever. After thinking for a few minutes, I called my former high school teacher, Mara Kent. She had always believed in me and often reminded me that I deserved better than the way I was treated at home. When she heard my voice, she immediately told me to come over. She didn't ask questions on the phone. She simply said, "You're not spending Christmas alone." That evening, she gave me a warm meal, a clean room, and enough kindness to make me cry after holding everything in for hours. I barely slept that night. My mind kept returning to Grandpa's letter and the mystery waiting inside that bank. The next morning, I tucked the letter into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers tightly around the tiny key. As I walked through the bank doors, I had no idea what I was about to find. I only knew my grandfather had never broken a promise, and somehow I believed he wasn't about to start now. The bank manager looked at my identification, compared it with the paperwork attached to the key, and gave me a gentle smile. "Your grandfather left very clear instructions," he said. "Everything inside belongs to you." He led me into a quiet room where a large metal box was placed on the table. My heart was pounding as he unlocked it and stepped outside to give me privacy. For a few seconds I just stared at the contents. There were neatly organized folders, several old journals, family photographs, investment statements, and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Every item had been carefully arranged as though he wanted to make sure I could find exactly what I needed. I opened the financial records first. The numbers didn't seem real. Years before I was born, Grandpa Elias had sold a piece of family land that had been in our family for generations. Instead of spending the money, he invested part of it in an account created for me. Every birthday, every Christmas, and every year after that, he quietly added more to it. The investments had grown steadily for over a decade. Tears filled my eyes as I realized the account now held enough money to pay for my entire college education, with plenty left to help me start my adult life. My parents had spent years acting like they controlled my future, but Grandpa had already protected it long before they could touch it. Then I opened the journals. Each notebook was dated, and every page described events my grandfather had witnessed over the years. He wrote about conversations with my father, Gavin, who repeatedly asked for early access to money that was never meant for him. Sometimes he claimed he wanted to expand a business. Other times he said the family needed emergency help. Grandpa had carefully written down every excuse, every request, and every meeting. As I kept reading, the truth became impossible to ignore. My father's gambling problem hadn't started recently. It had been destroying his finances for many years. He had borrowed money from relatives, broken promises, and hidden losses from almost everyone. My mother had known about it and helped keep it secret instead of protecting me. I finally understood why Grandpa had waited until after my 19th birthday. None of this happened by accident. He had expected the day my parents would come after my future. He couldn't stop their betrayal, but he made sure they would never succeed. Sitting there alone with those papers, I realized I hadn't lost everything on Christmas morning. My grandfather had quietly given me a second chance before he was gone. For the first time in my life, I had a place that belonged to me. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom apartment with old floors and plain walls. But when I locked the door that first night, I felt safe. No one could force me to sign papers. No one could order me around. It was a feeling I had never experienced before. I spread everything Grandpa Elias had left across my kitchen table. The journals, financial records, legal documents, and family photographs were all carefully organized. Every folder answered one question while creating another. It became clear that he had planned every detail long before he passed away. Inside the final letter was the name of an attorney, Cole Mercer, along with a note telling me to trust him completely. I called his office the next morning, and he arranged to meet me that afternoon. Cole welcomed me into his office and immediately recognized my grandfather's handwriting. After reading the documents, he smiled and said, "Your grandfather was very thorough. He made sure every dollar meant for you was protected by legally binding trust. Your parents cannot claim it, borrow it, or pressure anyone into giving it to them." Hearing those words felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. As Cole continued reviewing the files, his expression suddenly became more serious. He pulled out several documents I hadn't noticed before. They showed my father had approached different people over the years asking for loans. He claimed he would soon receive access to family inheritance money that actually belonged to me. He had used promises about wealth that was never his to convince people to trust him. Cole quietly placed the papers back into the folder. "These records could become very important," he said. "Your grandfather documented everything for a reason. While I was trying to rebuild my life, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. My father called over and over again. When I didn't answer, my mother started leaving voice messages. They suddenly sounded kind and concerned. They said Christmas should be about forgiveness. They wanted me to come home for dinner and claimed they missed me. A week earlier, those messages might have worked. Now I understood exactly why they were reaching out. They weren't worried about losing their daughter. They were worried about losing the money they believed they could still convince me to hand over." I deleted every voicemail without replying. For years I had mistaken manipulation for love. Thanks to my grandfather, I finally saw the difference. Their lies were beginning to fall apart, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. Over the next several days, Cole and I carefully sorted through every document my grandfather had left behind. There were years of financial records, handwritten notes, bank statements, and copies of agreements. The more we uncovered, the harder it became to accept that I had lived beside the truth for so long without ever seeing it. One afternoon, Cole placed a stack of papers in front of me. "I think you're ready to see this," he said quietly. The documents showed that my father's gambling debts were far greater than I had imagined. This wasn't a recent problem that had suddenly appeared. It had been growing for years. Every time he lost money, he borrowed more, believing he would somehow win it back. Instead, the debt became larger until it was impossible to hide. What hurt even more was learning that my mother had known almost everything. She hadn't been fooled by my father. She had chosen to protect his secret. Whenever another loan became overdue, she helped move money between accounts to keep creditors from asking questions. She withdrew savings that had taken years to build. She made excuses to relatives who wondered why bills weren't being paid. Together they kept pretending everything was fine while the situation became worse. As we continued reviewing the records, another painful truth appeared. My parents had already emptied most of their retirement savings. After that, they borrowed against the family home to keep paying old debts. Even that wasn't enough. Every source of money had slowly disappeared. Then I understood why they had suddenly become interested in my college fund. It wasn't because they believed the family would recover. It wasn't a temporary loan like my father had claimed. My education fund was simply the last valuable asset they could reach. Once that money was gone, they would have nothing left. I sat there staring at the paperwork, remembering Christmas morning. I had spent hours wondering if I had been selfish for refusing to help them. Now I finally understood the truth. That argument had never been about family. They weren't asking me to make a sacrifice together. They were asking me to destroy my own future so they could escape the consequences of choices they had been making for years. A strange sense of peace settled over me. For the first time, I stopped blaming myself for being thrown out of the house. I hadn't broken my family apart by refusing to sign those papers. Their own decisions had already done that long before Christmas arrived. All I had done was refuse to become the final payment for mistakes that were never mine to carry. About a week later, everything changed again. The angry phone calls stopped. The threats disappeared. Suddenly, my parents sounded like completely different people. My father left a voicemail saying he was sorry. He admitted he had let his emotions get out of control and begged me to give him another chance. He even cried during one message, something I had almost never seen him do. He said Christmas should never have ended the way it did and promised our family could still fix everything. My mother followed with messages of her own. She blamed the stress of the holidays and claimed everyone had said things they didn't mean. She insisted they loved me and wanted me back home. She kept repeating that families should forgive each other and move forward together. A month earlier, I probably would have believed every word. Now I understood why their attitude had changed so suddenly. They had finally realized they couldn't reach my college fund. Their plan had failed and now they were trying a different approach. Instead of ignoring them forever, I agreed to meet once. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted them to understand that the truth could no longer be hidden. We met at a quiet coffee shop in the middle of the afternoon. Other customers sat nearby, making it impossible for anyone to start yelling like they had at home. When I arrived, my parents were already waiting. My father stood up and tried to hug me, but I stepped back. He looked embarrassed before sitting down again. He started apologizing almost immediately. He said he had made terrible mistakes and asked me to come home. My mother nodded beside him, wiping tears from her face. She said they missed me and wanted to be a family again. I listened without interrupting. When they finally finished talking, I reached into my bag and placed several copies of Grandpa Elias's journals on the table. Neither of them spoke. My father slowly picked up the first page. As he recognized Grandpa's handwriting, the color drained from his face. My mother leaned closer, reading entries that described conversations they thought nobody else knew about. Every request for money, every false promise, and every attempt to gain control of my inheritance had been carefully recorded. The silence around the table became almost unbearable. I didn't accuse them of anything. I didn't raise my voice or demand explanations. I simply stood up, looked at both of them and said, "Grandpa believed one day I would need the truth more than excuses." Then I walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. I left them sitting there with those journals in front of them, wondering how much evidence my grandfather had collected and realizing their secrets had never been as hidden as they believed. A few days after meeting my parents at the coffee shop, Cole called and asked me to stop by his office again. His voice sounded calm, but there was something about it that made me think he had discovered one last piece of my grandfather's plan. When I arrived, the sealed envelope with my name on it was sitting on his desk. "I think your grandfather wanted us to open this only after everything else had been explained," Cole said as he carefully handed it to me. I slowly broke the seal. Inside was another handwritten letter from Grandpa Elias along with several legal documents. I took a deep breath and began reading. He wrote that he loved me more than words could ever express. He hoped I would never need the protections he had spent years creating, but he knew hope alone wasn't enough. He had watched my parents too closely to leave my future unprotected. The documents explained that he had created a separate trust in my name. It contained additional investments that would continue growing over time. The money would be released to me in stages as I reached different milestones in life. At first, I wondered why he had divided everything instead of giving it to me all at once. Then Cole pointed to one section written in clear legal language. If either Gavin or Leona gained direct control over my finances, pressured me into transferring ownership, or convinced me to hand over trust assets, every future payment would automatically stop until a court confirmed I was financially independent again. I looked up at Cole in surprise. So they can never touch it? I asked. He smiled and gently shook his head. No. Your grandfather thought of every possibility. He made sure your future could never become their solution. I sat quietly, trying to understand how carefully Grandpa had planned everything. He hadn't simply left me money. He had built a wall around my future that my parents could never break through. For years I believed I had to obey them because I depended on them. Now that fear disappeared. They couldn't threaten to take away my education. They couldn't pressure me into signing papers. They couldn't use guilt to make me sacrifice everything I had. For the first time since I was a little girl, I felt completely free. As I folded Grandpa's letter and placed it back into the envelope, I whispered a quiet thank you. Even after he was gone, he was still protecting me. When I walked out of Cole's office that afternoon, the world looked different. The fear that had followed me for years was finally gone. My parents no longer controlled my future. Every decision ahead would belong to me, and for the first time in my life, I truly believed I was free to build the life my grandfather had always wanted for me. About 2 months after I left home, everything my parents had worked so hard to hide finally began coming into the open. The calls from my father stopped completely. Instead of trying to convince me to return, he was suddenly dealing with problems that could no longer be ignored. Cole contacted me after receiving several requests from investigators looking into my father's financial history. Some of the people who had loaned Gavin money had discovered that he used false financial statements and promises about future inheritance to gain their trust. When payments stopped, they started comparing documents. The stories didn't match and questions quickly followed. Because my grandfather had kept detailed records, it didn't take long to separate my finances from my father's debts. Every investment account, every trust document, and every legal paper clearly showed that the money belonged only to me. There was no legal connection that allowed Gavin to claim any part of it. Cole told me that Grandpa Elias had organized everything so carefully that there was almost no room for confusion. Your grandfather protected you better than most people ever think to, he said. These documents speak for themselves. For the first time I felt completely safe. No matter what happened to my parents financially, no creditor could come after the money Grandpa had left for me. A few weeks later, my mother surprised me by asking if we could meet alone. We sat quietly across from each other in a small park. She looked exhausted, older than I remembered, and unlike the confident woman who had stood beside my father all those years. She didn't ask me for money. Instead, she looked down at her hands and said something I never expected to hear. I spent years protecting your father, she whispered. I should have been protecting you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't a complete apology. She didn't erase everything that had happened, and she didn't ask me to forgive her. She simply admitted what I had already learned from Grandpa's journals. She had chosen the wrong person over and over again. When we said goodbye, I wished her well, but I knew things could never return to the way they once were. As the months passed, more of my father's lies unraveled. The false promises, hidden debts, and broken agreements were no longer secrets because every claim was met with written evidence. I didn't celebrate watching my parents face the consequences of their actions. I simply watched from a distance, knowing I no longer had to carry the weight of their choices. The fear that shaped my childhood had finally been replaced by something much stronger. The truth had done what I never could. It had brought every hidden lie into the light. By the time summer ended, my life looked nothing like it had on that Christmas morning. Instead of worrying about where I would sleep or how I would pay for school, I was carrying books across a college campus I had dreamed about attending for years. Thanks to my grandfather's careful planning, I didn't have to borrow money or live with the fear of crushing debt after graduation. Every step I took reminded me that someone had believed in my future long before I could see it myself. The first few weeks weren't easy. I was surrounded by students whose lives seemed normal compared to mine. Some talked about weekend visits home or family dinners. I smiled politely, but deep inside I still carried memories that refused to disappear. Every Christmas decoration I passed brought back the image of standing outside my parents' house with nothing except a trash bag and an unopened card. Those memories still hurt, but they no longer controlled my life. Instead of staying trapped in the past, I focused on building something new. I studied harder than I ever had before because I knew every class was an opportunity my grandfather had sacrificed to give me. Whenever I felt tired or overwhelmed, I remembered his words and kept moving forward. During the holiday season, I started volunteering at a local community center that helped teenagers and young adults who had been forced to leave difficult homes. I didn't tell anyone my full story. I simply listened when someone needed to talk, helped organize meals, and made sure nobody spent Christmas feeling completely alone if I could help it. One evening, a young girl thanked me for treating her with kindness after she had lost everything. As I watched her smile for the first time that day, I realized I was honoring Grandpa Elias in the best way I possibly could. He had protected me when I needed someone most. Now I had the chance to offer hope to someone else. Life wasn't perfect. There were still moments when I wished things had been different. I sometimes wondered what my childhood could have been if my parents had chosen love over greed. Those questions would probably never disappear completely. But I refused to let bitterness become part of my future. The greatest gift Grandpa left behind wasn't the investment account or the trust. Those things gave me security, but they weren't the most valuable part of his legacy. He gave me something far more important. He gave me the freedom to choose my own path, to build a life based on honesty instead of fear, and to become the kind of person I needed when I was 19 years old. That was a gift no amount of money could ever replace. A full year passed before Christmas came around again. This time I woke up in my own apartment instead of my parents' house. The room smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls. Soft lights decorated the small tree standing near the window, and for the first time in many years, I felt completely at peace. That evening, Mara Kent came over for dinner, along with Cole Mercer and a few friends I had made during my first year of college. We laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed a simple meal together. There were no arguments, no fear, and no one asking me to sacrifice my future for their mistakes. It wasn't the biggest celebration, but it was filled with something I had been missing for most of my life: genuine kindness. Before everyone arrived, I took one last look at the framed Christmas card hanging above my desk. Inside the frame was the original card Grandpa Elias had mailed before he passed away, along with a small handwritten note that had changed everything. For the day they show you who they really are. Every morning those words reminded me how one moment had completely changed the direction of my life. Around the same time I learned that my parents had finally lost the family home. Years of hidden debt, unpaid loans, and financial deception had caught up with them. There was no dramatic ending, no miracle that saved them from the consequences of their choices. Everything they had tried to avoid eventually became impossible to escape. A few relatives quietly suggested that I should help them now that I had the money. I politely refused. Not because I wanted revenge, but because rescuing them would only continue the same cycle that had almost destroyed my future. They had every opportunity to make different decisions. Those choices belonged to them just as my future now belonged to me. I didn't celebrate their downfall. There was nothing joyful about watching people lose everything, especially when they were my parents. I simply accepted that actions always have consequences, even when they take years to appear. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood by the window as snow slowly covered the streets. I quietly thanked Grandpa Elias for believing in me long before I believed in myself. That Christmas card had never been an ordinary holiday greeting. It was a promise, a plan, and a lifeline prepared with love and wisdom. It protected me exactly when I needed it most. Looking back, I realized my grandfather's greatest lesson had nothing to do with money. Real family isn't measured by shared blood or the house you grow up in. It's measured by love, sacrifice, honesty, and keeping your promises even when no one is watching. That is the gift I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Thanks for staying with me until the end. Now I want to hear from you. Did Brenna make the right choice, or would you have done something different? Share your thoughts in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for more emotional stories. See you in the next one.